All right, day 25, we're looking at Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, where Jesus is having his wilderness experience. And we learn that every way shower has a wilderness experience. And because you are a way shower, you're following Jesus' example, you also will have wilderness experiences to deal with your soul, your mind, which is your thinking, your heart, which is your feeling, your intellect, which is your processing, and your will, which is your decision making. And we're dealing with that fourth aspect of the soul today, which is the will. All right, and so our verse for today, and it's so amazing, everything is in divine order. 1 Corinthians 10:13, there is no temptation that has taken you, but such that is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation make a way of escape that you might be able to bear it. Our denial for today is that there are no bad choices. Come on, deny it. You know, you say, well, I made some bad choices. There are no bad choices. Come on, deny that. Get rid of that erroneous idea, that limiting belief, that faulty perception. There are no bad choices. There are only lessons and blessings. Either you experience a reward for making the highest choice that you could make, or you experience the lesson from making a lower choice. But there are no bad choices. Our affirmation, I align my will with the will of God. I align my will with the will of God. And our kingdom principle is divine placement. I'm exact because I've made no bad choices, because there are no bad choices. There are only lessons and blessings. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be in every area of my life. Well, our subject for today, and people say, well, what is God's will? How do we know what God's will is? And so our subject for today is God's will for you is absolute good. Come on, say that with me. Absolute good. One more time. Absolute. God's will for me, God's will for you is absolute good. And let me tell you, coming from a traditional Christian background, I had a real challenge. This is one of the basic ideas of New Thought Christianity, of metaphysics, of truth teachings, whatever you desire to call it, is that God's will for you is absolute good. You know, that it's God's will. And John, who is love, in 3 John, in the first chapter, he said, brethren and sisters, beloved, I wish above all things that you would prosper and be in health, even as your soul prospers. That God's wish for you, God's will for you, is that you would prosper and be in health. It is God's will that every person on the face of this earth live a happy, healthy, prosperous, and successful life. So we're talking about absolute good, not sometime good, not halfway good, but God's will for you, God's will for me is absolute good. All right, pulley point number one. There is only one will that God has for all of God's offspring. All of God's sons, all of God's daughters, God only has one will. There are no wills of God. There is only one will of God, and that one will of God is for all of creation. That one will of God, which is absolute good, is for all of God's sons, it's for all of God's daughters, it's for all of God's children, for all of God's offspring. God has one will, and that will is absolute good. It's for me, it's for you, it's for everybody. It's for the flowers, it's for the birds, it's for the fish in the sea, it's for the stars and the galaxies. If people are on other planets, it's for them too. That God only has one will. And so just get out of your mind that there's a different will, and you know, this idea that there's a permissive will of God, and that there's like God has different wills. God only has one will. There's no scripture in the Bible where you'll ever see God's will as plural. God's will is always singular. It's one will of God, and that will of God is absolute good. Come on, say that with me. There's only one will of God, and that will of God is absolute good, and it's for everybody. That one will of God, absolute good, is for everybody. Now, I have 3 offspring in the natural, and several offspring in the spiritual, and I only have one will for them, and that is that they absolute good. I desire the best for them. You know, I have one will, and what that looks like on each one of them and how that plays out in each one of their lives is different. But as a spiritual father, as a natural father, as a parent, I only have one will for my children, is that I desire the best for them. And if you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. If you're a person that has siblings, if you're a person that has friends, if you really summarize everything that you wanted, everything that you desired for that person, it's good. You desire that they have the best, they live the best, they be the best. The best that life has to offer is what your will is for them. And so God, you know, has one will for us, for all of God's offspring, and that's absolute good. Pulley point number 2, and this is going to probably challenge you. God's will is being done. There is no, you know, I hope God's will be done. I'm praying that God's will be done. God's will is being done. God's will, God is the God of the universe. God is all power, omnipotence. You know, God is omniscience, all-knowing, all-seeing. That God is omnipresent. That there is no time when God's will is not being done. God's will is always being done. And I know that that's a challenging idea for you to wrap your mind around, but there is no time, no place, no space where God's will is not being done. God is so powerful that God's will is always being done. Regardless of how it looks, regardless of how it sounds, regardless to, people call it devastation, people call it tragedy, travesty, whatever you describe it, God's will is being done. Right here and right now, God's will is being done. Now, we may not fully understand what that will is. We may not fully agree with what that will is, but God's will is being done all the time. All right, pulley point number 1, there's only one will of God. Pulley point number 2 is that will of God is being done all the time. There is no time. Let me tell you, God is not going to have a will. I'm the creator of the universe. I'm all power. I'm all presence. And you mean tell me my will is not going to be done? You know you want your will to be done all the time. And if you really had all power, you would make sure that your will was done all the time. So why would God, you know, not have God's will being done all the time when God has the power to have God's will being done all the time? So God only has one will, and that will is being done all the time. Pulley point number 3. So since God only has one will, and since God's will is being done all the time, then what you need to do, what I need to do, is align my will with the will of God. Because you have a will. And your will and God's will may not always be the same. And so what your spiritual practices are is I align my will with the will of God. That's what Jesus was doing in the Garden of Gethsemane. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thy will be done. That's what Jesus is doing in the wilderness. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thy will be done. And that's where your spiritual practices come in. Prayer and meditation, reading and studying, praise and worship and thanksgiving. That's where fasting comes in, meditation, stillness and silence, journaling, because it may not look like God's will to you. But when you know that God's will is absolute good and God's will is being done, you align your will with God's will through your spiritual practices. And so it gets you to see things differently. Because God's will is being done with everybody all the time, but you have to see it differently in order to be able to bring your will in alignment with God's will. Whatever process a person is going through, whatever lesson or blessing they are receiving, it is the absolute will of God. Wherever they are in their lives, it is where they need to be for their soul's unfoldment. It is God's will being done. That's the only way that we can say Romans 8:28. And we know And if you look at the verses above it, it talked about praying in the Spirit. You know, that our spirit makes moans and groans that cannot be uttered. That our spirit makes intercession for us, praying the perfect will of God. And so when your spirit prays, your spirit is praying that you might be in alignment with God's will, that you bring your will, your decision making, your choices, your perception in alignment with the will of God. And that's why we can't afford to take any breaks from our spiritual practices, because it keeps my will in alignment with the will of God. I'm not fighting the will of God. I'm not feeling like there's an alternative will for me. I'm not saying, well, everything is good except this. All things are working together for the good, because that's God's will, absolute good. So everything in the universe, everything in your life, everything in my life, everything that's going on in the cities and the states and the countries, it is God's will being done. Let me tell you, you may not see it as God's will being done, but God's will is being done. So just align your will with the will of God. Let me tell you something. When you get to a place in Christ consciousness, and Joseph in the Old Testament, he represented the Christ consciousness, just like Jesus in the New Testament represented the Christ consciousness. And Joseph said, in his Christ consciousness, in his alignment of his will with God's will, he said, I'm not mad with anybody about anything. He said, you may have meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Even what people mean for evil, even what looks like evil, whether it's a bomb, whether it's people being killed, and I know this is challenging for people, you know, people, whatever it is, and we could go through a whole list. You said, you mean to tell me that's God's will? God's will is being done. And if you can't wrap your mind around how this can be God's will, then align your mind with divine mind. There's a bigger purpose. There's a higher plan that you may not be able to see right now. There's something that is being worked out in the universe. There is a soul assignment. There is a soul decision and covenant that happened even before people came to this earth that is bigger than what you even understand. So just know the truth today, that God only has one will, and that will is for all of God's children, and that will is absolute good. That God's will is being done everywhere all the time, because God is the everywhere evenly present spirit of absolute good. So pulley point number 3, the best thing I can advise you to do, and the best thing I can advise me to do, is to align my will with the will of God, because God's will is absolute good. Good is all there is, because God is all there is. There is nothing else going on but God. Yes, the devastation, the tragedy, the hurricane, the earthquake, you know, what the financial upheaval, whatever you want to label it as, it is good, because it is God's will. And God can't do anything but good. God can't be anything but good. God can't manifest anything but good. And it's easy to say this, but when you really get in a situation and it looks horrible, say, I align my will with the will of God. I love you so much. God bless you. Thank you so much for being a part of the Daily Download. Sow a seed, meet a need, boost this post. You know, go back and watch the replay a couple times if you need to. But God only has one will, and that will is absolute good. Join me at 7 o'clock on my personal page, Darrell R. Pulley, and we're going to pray together this Wednesday morning. You'll be able to give your prayer requests. So I'll actually see you in a few minutes. All right, I love you. God bless you. I don't know what you call Jesus, but I call him Wayshower, my example of what it means to be fully human and fully divine.